Welcome to tonight's event, The Borders of Truth, Misinformation in the Immigration Debate. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Asia Lara, and I'm a program manager at Humanities Washington. We're a nonprofit organization whose mission is to open minds and bridge divides by creating spaces to explore different perspectives. We at Humanities Washington acknowledge that we present this program from the traditional and occupied lands of the Coast Salish peoples. We ask for those participating in this event, wherever they may be, to reflect on the lands that they inhabit and to acknowledge the ancestral and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. This event is part of Humanities Washington's Rebuilding Democracy Initiative, a deep dive into the state of democracy, voting, and civic engagement that is presented in partnership with stations KUOW, KPBX, and Northwest Public Broadcasting. It is produced with the support of the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We thank them for their contributions. We also have several upcoming Speakers Bureau events, so please check out our calendar at humanities.org to register for talks on such topics as the country that fiction built and why your hair matters to society. If you're interested in programs like these, please consider donating through our website as well. Before we begin, please note that this is a recorded event. Tonight, our guest speaker will be taking questions following her presentation, so please submit your questions at any point through the Q&A box. This is a time of high pressure, both politically and in everyone's personal lives. Our goal at Humanities Washington is to create space where we can have important conversations in a civil manner. Inappropriate comments or questions, harassment, or otherwise hostile behavior will result in removal from the event. We are in different places with different circumstances and beliefs, but even so, tonight we are together contemplating the same questions. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Sophia Jordán Wallace is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Washington. She also serves as director of the Washington Institute for the Study of Inequality and Race. Her research interests include the politics of race and ethnicity, immigration politics and policy, Latino politics, representation, and the immigrant rights protests of 2006. And without further ado, please take it away, Sophia.
Thank you, Asia, and thank you, Dustin, and everybody at Humanities Washington for this invitation. And thank you to everyone who has come out tonight. This is a really wonderful turnout. I know many of you are very zoomed out, so I see 180 of you logged in. So I really appreciate you turning out for this event. Before I get started, I always like to give just a little brief background of myself, just to give people a sense of where I'm coming from on the topic. So I am not a native Seattleite or Washingtonian. I grew up in the Bay Area. I spent the first 20 years of my life in California and then moved to the East Coast. And I've also lived in the Midwest and in the South. Some of these places have been places that I taught in different public universities or attended school. And the reason why I mention this is I've had a long-term interest in immigration. And so I have a lot of experience talking to people who have come from very different perspectives about immigration, people from different backgrounds, including my own personal background. Both of my parents are immigrants. My mom is from England and my dad is from Peru. So this is a deeply personal issue for me, although I will say that I often, have very spirited conversations with my parents about immigration, in large part because we have very different political ideologies. I'm sure by the time the end of this presentation goes on, you'll have a very clear sense of where I stand on immigration. All right, so with that, I'm gonna get started. Let's see. So what I wanna do is start by talking to you a little bit here about what is the connection that I want to draw. And this is not gonna be the primary focus of this presentation, but I think it's a really interesting kind of window to think about is what happened in the 2020 election. So right now, all of us are aware that we're commonly discussing the 2020 election and the subsequent framing around the election being stolen as the big lie. And a lot of people are asking this question of, but how did this happen? How is it that misinformation about the election became so widespread that a large segment of the population, and here I don't mean 50%, I mean, even if it's 20 or 30% of the population, believes that there was election fraud and the election was stolen, and that this myth and even, skepticism about the election security was propagated by political elites, and by political elites, I mean elected officials. How did that come to be? People are asking this question. This isn't the United States. This isn't what happens here. And as we all know, on January 6th, this manifested in the insurrection in which the Capitol of the United States was stormed. And so this has caused a lot of questions beyond questions around democracy and whether we're facing democratic backsliding, but it's also brought up a lot of questions about misinformation and what is the role of both the media and elites in propagating that misinformation. And what I want to suggest to you today is that one way for us to understand how this became so dominant in the 2020 election and subsequently is to look at the case study of immigration, because immigration is an area that is mired in all kinds of misinformation and myths, and some ideas about immigration that were once very radical and fringe, held by a very tiny proportion of the public and elected officials, eventually became mainstream. So at least among some segment of the population. And they became repeated over and over and over again through the media, through political campaigns, and by political elites. And so I want to suggest to you that when we allow misinformation and myths to propagate, it shapes not only how people think about politics, it shapes how elected officials behave, and it also affects the types of public policy solutions that we're looking for. Except the problem is all of these actions are being influenced by false information. So how did this all start on immigration? A lot of people don't realize that it's actually the case that in immigration reform, pre-1986, we really talked about immigration reform at the federal level as bipartisan. And in fact, in 1986, when comprehensive immigration reform was enacted, it was signed into law by a Republican president, by President Reagan. And it was co-sponsored legislation by both Democrats and Republicans and was considered a very popular policy. Now, if we think about where we are today, this might surprise some people, but this bill actually allowed a pathway among many other components in the legislation. It allowed a pathway for 3 million people to legalize their status. And I think that's a really important point because now we're in a moment where we can barely move forward on anything on immigration. And what this means is that at that time period, both of the political parties spoke very similarly about immigration. And it's my contention that they largely agreed on the facts. So what do I mean by the facts? Here I mean that they agreed about what was the state of immigration in the country, meaning what were the levels, who was entering the country, through which means. They agreed on the contributions of immigrants. They agreed on different solutions related to problems in the immigration system. They agreed on many elements of immigration, and then that allowed them to negotiate compromise between each other. Now, I'm not saying in any way that they agreed on every single outcome, because of course they didn't. The parties still represented different platforms, but they agreed on a common set of facts. What ended up happening is through the 90s, though, parties increasingly began to diverge, not just on immigration, but on a lot of different things. But in particular on immigration, we had this fringe group on the right that was starting to really use anti-immigrant rhetoric and start to propagate some stereotypes on immigration. But it was still pretty marginalized. And in fact, sometimes the Republican Party was very negative about members of their party who pushed those myths or tried to run on those types of stereotypes. But over time, as we saw general increasing polarization in the public, and in the 2000s, we really saw the emergence of rhetoric versus reality, is what I'm calling it here. And what I mean is that there were substantive facts about immigration, and then there was now rhetoric from the right that really didn't comport with reality in any way. However, that started to dominate media depictions of immigration and our discussions around public policy. We also know that another thing that was happening that is really important in understanding immigration in this moment is the increasing salience of immigration as an issue. So traditionally, when we ask people, it's a very common question, what's the most important public policy problem facing the country, or what's the most important policy issue to you? This is one of the ways we measure salience. When we ask that question, not very many people said immigration historically. However, over the 2000s, we noticed that instead of it being primarily Latinos who rank that as a top 3 or 5 issue, we noticed that increasingly people who are white and conservative or white and identified as Republicans were increasingly likely to rate immigration as an important issue. So, what that signaled to us is there was likely some negative immigration feelings that were starting to drive salience amongst a segment of the public. So this has really contributed to where we are now, which is that myths and misinformation are really driving policies, positions by elected officials, legislation, and opinion. So I want to talk briefly about this sort of anti-immigrant media environment that has been well documented, especially by Leo Chavez, who's an anthropologist at UC Irvine. And I want to tell you a little bit about both the media depictions, but also the political depictions. So these are two magazine covers that are on immigration. And one of the things that Leo Chavez in his work does, looking at magazines in particular, the covers of them, is he shows us that there starts to be these narratives and metaphors that are used to describe immigration. And they're always fairly negative. And they basically drive anti-immigrant feelings. One of the most common narratives is the idea that the border is in crisis. And I want to just note to you that the date from this cover predates Trump. It's 2014. And so one of the questions I often get is, well, isn't all of this caused by Trump? And my answer is always no. Even things like the border wall, we've been asking public polling on that actually since the 90s. And there have been discussions of it and movement on that issue for quite some time now under multiple presidents. And so it's really important to think about this beyond Trump, but it would be foolish not to address what has been his role. And so this crisis narrative, but also then this framing around, if you look at the Time cover, talking about it's outrageously easy to sneak in. So this idea that the border is not under control, that it's a permeable border. And also framing it in terms of even after 9/11 is again, this movement towards connecting immigration as an issue to security and securitization. And that's really important as we think about militarized border policies. Now, I want to warn you before I show you the next slide on political ads that these are fairly graphic. And so I just want to warn people that these are deeply racialized anti-immigrant political ads, but it's an important device to discuss the way in which candidates use this imagery to really stoke fear. So these are some screenshots of Trump's Facebook ads in which he is clearly framing immigration in terms of it's an emergency, there's safety at issue, and then using these as a justification for the wall. But some people sometimes say, well, maybe that was just Trump, or maybe it's people who run for president, or maybe it's people who run for Senate. But here, this is a very graphic, racist ad that is at the level of a county executive. And it's clear here that this candidate, Laura Curran, is drawing a connection here, trying to play on, if you notice in the text of the ad, where she's talking about sanctuary counties, talking about sanctuary policies, and she's trying to draw a connection here between immigration, sanctuary, and then gangs, MS-13. And this is clearly going into extremely explicit language. And so while in this moment, we often talk about us being in a period where there's less explicitly racialized language, many people kind of post-Trump are saying, well, no, Trump basically brought back explicit language. Clearly, this is an explicit ad. So what this does is it gives rise to various metaphors that are used to describe immigration, and it really propagates these different myths. One of the most dominant, and I'm only going to talk about 4 now, but I'm happy to address more in the Q&A. One of the most dominant is on immigrants and crime. And so repeatedly, you'll hear elites and in the media describe this connection, supposedly, between either immigrants' propensity to commit crimes or specifically undocumented immigrants. But the way in which this myth has become so dominant is really concerning because it really does affect how we think about both the group and the policies, but it also really has no basis in empirical reality. So if we look at the data, this is data showing what is the crime and the conviction rates, right? And looking at this across all crimes, homicide, and larceny. And it's comparing across people who are native born, undocumented immigrants, and legal immigrants. And you'll notice immediately that the rates are much lower for anyone in any immigrant status. Likewise, if we look at this data, which comes from an article written by two sociologists, you'll notice that the relationship here, what this is showing, is that as undocumented immigrants are a larger proportion of the population, right? So over here, increasing a large proportion of the population, there's actually a lower violent crime rate. Again, these empirics are the opposite of what is the public narrative. So what are the consequences of having this myth? Well, obviously, and most directly, it reinforces negative stereotypes and negative public framing of immigrants. And I want to be clear that while belief in this stereotype is stronger amongst those who identify as Republican and conservative, it does not mean that this stereotype is not also believed by some segments of people who identify as Democrats or independents. In fact, there's pretty consistent data that actually these stereotypes are really widely believed in the public, albeit more strongly so amongst certain segments. But what drawing this connection between immigrants and crime really does is it stokes fear of immigrants, and it really adds to what Leo Chavez calls the immigrant threat narrative, that people should be afraid of immigrants because they actually represent a true and present threat to their safety. Fundamentally, connecting immigrants to crimes is also a method of dehumanization. If we can frame immigrants as criminals and more likely to engage in crime, then this is a way to basically cast essentially less rights upon them. Now, it probably won't surprise you that, I obviously completely disagree with this framing around immigrants, but it is a way to dehumanize immigrants by those who are trying to push anti-immigrant policies. It's also a way to really focus on illegality as well and try to, and using the language around illegality in particular, many scholars have argued is also a way in which to dehumanize immigrants, even though immigrant rights activists suggest that there's no such thing as a human being that is illegal. On the policy end, it really pushes us towards punitive policy frames as necessary for security. Because if you believe immigrants are more likely to commit crime, then that necessitates a response to ensure the security of the public. Likewise, you're probably going to be pushing policies that lower the levels of immigration. The next two myths are highly related, and I'm going to talk about them in conjunction with one another. The first is that immigration is a crisis. And here, we've all heard the narratives that the levels of undocumented immigrants is going through the roof, right? Leo Chavez talks about this as a narrative where the borders are completely out of control, that there's a flow of unstoppable immigrants. But if we look at the data on the rise of undocumented immigrants and where the level has been, you can see that the most marked increase, where the slope is the steepest, is between 1990 and 2005. And since 2005, we've either been experiencing a decline or a leveling off. So this entire narrative is literally not based in empirical reality whatsoever. And so if we think about when Trump announced his candidacy in June of 2015, we were at one of our lowest points. And so again, the rhetoric isn't necessarily matching the reality. The third myth, that immigration is out of control, implies that there is no enforcement, that there is lax enforcement. And in fact, in partisan circles, this has largely been framed around Democrats doing nothing on immigration enforcement. However, again, those of us who study immigration and immigration rights activists would be very quick to point out that that couldn't be farther from the truth. If we look at deportations, we see that deportations have largely been increasing over time, but in particular, the largest set of years where there is the most deportations occurred between 2008 and 2014. Those were all years under Obama as president. And in fact, former President Obama has been widely critiqued for the 3 million deportations that occurred while he was president. And we can talk about this more in Q&A, but a lot of the political explanation of why that happened was that Obama thought that being quote unquote tough on immigration would lead to a willingness by Republicans to engage in compromise in Congress and actually get comprehensive immigration reform passed. We know that didn't actually happen. But again, this is a clear evidence that even Democrats are certainly engaging in immigration enforcement. If we look at the number of officers that are in Customs Border Patrol agents, ICE agents, you can see that this data over time shows again the same pattern where we only see increasing numbers of agents. So it is actually not realistic or accurate to point out and say, but there aren't enough agents. Likewise, if we look at the Border Patrol budget, it is a very stark pattern that this budget has only gone in one direction since 1990. And we see this budget just increasing. So these two myths together, that immigration is a crisis, it's out of control, that enforcement doesn't exist, have very serious consequences. One, most directly, again, it's contributing to the immigrant threat narrative. But it's also using these elaborate metaphors, for example, the infinity line that often gets depicted in magazines and political cartoons, where there's this line, never-ending line of immigrants trying to cross the southern border, descriptions of immigrants as a flood, that these essentially have become dominant in media and political elite discourse on immigration. And what this invokes is this idea that immigrants represent an uncontrollable mass. And if we think about these metaphors, there's no way that a flood can be conceived of anything other than negative, right? And we think about a flood as causing damage, as uncontrollable. And so these are clearly meant to push us towards policies that are, one, focused on borders, which again, I'm happy to address this in Q&A, but there's another myth is that undocumented immigrants primarily or only cross through the southern border, when in fact visa overstays represent at least 50%. But so what these narratives, these other myths do, it pushes this focus on borders in our immigration policies. It really is focused on decreasing migrant flows and devoting more and more resources to enforcement. Because if you're saying, listen, immigration is out of control and enforcement needs more resources, you keep seeing this increase of money that's basically sent to these different departments within DHS, but you're essentially solving a problem that doesn't exist if there is no actual crisis and actually there's plenty of money. So you're creating a reinforcing loop then, where you need to spend this money on something, which then means you're spending this money on more and more enforcement. And so this really creates this sort of terrible cyclical pattern of punitive immigration policies. Another common stereotype is related to immigrants and taxes. And so there is widespread belief amongst the public that immigrants don't pay taxes. Now, we know that isn't true because taxes cannot be evaded by anyone in any 100% way, because some of how we pay taxes is at the state and local level, literally including buying things. But we also know that citizenship status, whether you are a citizen, whether you are a permanent resident, whether you are on a student visa, whether you're undocumented, is the US government's position that you are supposed to be paying federal income taxes. So taxes is not actually, you are not somehow exempted from paying taxes. And what we know is, and this is just a graphic that looks at undocumented immigrants, we know that actually undocumented immigrants are paying a lot of taxes, both at the state and local level, but also at the federal level. And these states that have these revenues from taxes are not uniformly blue or red states. You can see that with California and with Texas. And these are large sums of money. In fact, these sums of money are really critical for the economies in these various states and it's important for the federal government. One of the questions I often get is, okay, but at the federal level, how many undocumented immigrants actually pay taxes? And my response to that is it's a little bit tricky because we have imperfect ways that we figure out who's undocumented, who's paying who's paying taxes. But the estimates are between 50 and 75% of the undocumented population is paying federal income tax. In the public that's non-immigrant, it's estimated to be about 70 to 75% of the public is paying federal immigration and federal taxes. So those numbers aren't necessarily a huge gap, and I'm happy to return to that. But what this narrative does is it really frames immigrants. If we say immigrants don't pay any taxes, you're essentially framing immigrants as takers and that they're a net negative to society. And it really does lead to feeding into other stereotypes. For example, another myth is that undocumented immigrants are more likely to use welfare benefits or that they don't pay into Social Security. But if you pay federal income taxes, you are paying into Social Security. And in fact, you're not eligible to even have Social Security benefits. So you're paying into a system that you can't get out. Likewise, this welfare stereotype in 1996, there was welfare reform at the federal level under Clinton, which actually made it illegal for immigrants to have access to federal welfare benefits. So for quite some time, that has not even actually even been legal and possible, but yet that stereotype is very dominant. And all of these things go together. And again, this is not a purely Democrat or Republican belief. There is belief in these various stereotypes and myths across groups. But what this framing does of immigrants as people who don't pay taxes or don't pay their fair share, it again pushes us towards policies that would reduce immigration, stop immigration flows, and it also creates this new thing where now any reform, especially those that include a pathway to citizenship, is now framed in terms of paying back taxes, as if there were no taxes paid. However, if you look closely at most of that legislation, it asks for evidence that you have in fact been paying taxes and to show that you were paying taxes. But again, the public framing is often focused around this issue. So before I talk about some ways forward, I want to talk briefly about public opinion and where that fits in here, because I've laid out to you that there's this climate, this anti-immigrant climate, and then there's all these myths that get propagated. So what does this do to how people think about immigration? And I want to suggest to you that a lot of our discussions around immigration and public opinion lack nuance. So I'm definitely not saying that there's no polarized opinions, and I'm not saying that there is no difference between Democrats, independents, and Republicans. But I am saying that there's more areas of agreement, and maybe not on what you would expect, than is often discussed by both elected officials and by sort of the media and discussed in various narratives around immigration. So if we look at these, this data here from Pew, and this is talking about different policies, this is trying to show us where do people think are important areas for immigration policy. And these different components range across enforcement, as well as through different types of efforts to allow undocumented children to remain in the US, high skilled immigration, the wall. There's a lot of different policy issues here that are covered. But what I want to draw your attention to is if you look at the first policy area here, there's the most agreement across all these dimensions. There's the most agreement, and this is a national poll, on an enforcement policy, stricter policies to prevent people from overstaying their visas. 77% of the people polled here thought that was a very important immigration goal. Likewise, you have here, and again, I've talked about this stereotype, prevent immigrants here illegally from receiving government benefits if unqualified. Again, I've already explained that there is federal reform that has made this largely illegal, most of what this is referencing. However, again, people think this is a priority, so they want to fix something that is already not allowed. But notice that in the next policy issue area, it says allow those who came to the US without documentation as children to remain here. And there was 72% agreement. So again, people like to frame this as in there's no way to change anyone's status because Democrats and Republicans don't agree. Well, I think what we would say is 72%, and now, of course, this includes also independents, 72%. For people who study public opinion, like myself, we would say that constitutes a consensus, that there's agreement. And likewise, look at the wall. The wall is actually the least popular if we're looking at the sort of national level. Now, I'm going to show you another figure that shows what's the gap if we're looking at Democrats versus Republicans. So it jumps out to you probably immediately as that there is a gap between Democrats and Republicans on nearly every dimension here of immigration policy. However, there are some areas where while there is a 30 or 40 point gap, even one group is still above 50% in support of a policy. So if we look at the wall, it shouldn't surprise you that there's a lot more support amongst Republicans than there is Democrats, and the wall is very unpopular. And indeed, this data is from 2016 and is actually even more polarized now. But if you go back and you look at these questions, again, of things like allowing children to stay if they came without papers, you'll see that even 60% of Republicans polled here supported that policy and 82% of Democrats. So again, this gives us a slightly different picture. And this is kind of zooming in on that question to show you, and this is, again, it depends on when you're conducting the poll. This is 2020, so it's in an even more sort of polarized moment. We see some decline here on Republican support, but it's still important to note that we have 91% support amongst Democrats and still more than half of Republicans. And I think part of what we need to do is start thinking about what does coming to agreement and having support for policies mean? I want to talk very briefly, and I'm happy to answer this more in the question and answer. I want to talk very briefly about this book that I wrote recently and talk about what we did and what we found on public opinion. So we wrote this book thinking, okay, Trump has these very well-known policies on immigration, on the border wall, lots of controversy around children in detention, and his policy of family separation. And does the public actually support these policies? Or is there actually not very much support for these policies? Now, what we expected to find was that Democrats would be opposed to all these policies and that we would have a large amount of conservative and Republican support for Trump's policies. And one of the things we do in this book is try to look specifically as how do racial sentiments and racial anxieties motivate opinions on immigration policies? And what we find is the following. The wall is very popular amongst Republicans and really unpopular amongst Democrats. And not surprisingly, it's very popular against those who feel very anxious about demographic change and those who are very anxious about cultural changes and are basically espouse sort of racially resentful opinions. But we find that on child detention, that policy is actually not popular with anyone. All groups, Democrats, independents, and Republicans, and even amongst people who have these negative racial attitudes, pretty much are not in support of child detention. What we find is that people really believe that children should be released to family or to sponsors. So that policy is not popular at all, despite it being a very visible policy of the former Trump administration. And family separation as well, we find that about half of Republicans support that policy, but half oppose it. Likewise, people who are much more culturally or demographically anxious, they are much more likely to support this policy. And so what we find then is a little bit of a mixed bag. One of his policies is really popular, even amongst his base. One is not popular at all, and one is still about split. So where do we go from here? Well, I mean, obviously, I think that we need to repudiate lies and myths and misinformation. We have seen very much so in the 2020 election what allowing myths and misinformation, what that led to. It's not clear we would have seen the insurrection if there had been a much more clear repudiation of those lies and denouncement of them as lies when we know that the 2020 election was the most secure election that we've had in the history of the country. Likewise, on immigration, if we spoke honestly about immigration and immigrants, then these myths wouldn't have become as dominant. So I think we really need to return to facts. We need to also reject and disallow violent immigration rhetoric that demonizes immigrants and that is aimed at stoking fears. We need to also have honest conversations about immigration. Immigration is a controversial issue. It brings up a lot of feelings. People are very uncomfortable discussing immigration as an issue. They're uncomfortable talking about different policy issues, but it's not clear to me how we have a path forward without having some of those conversations. We also have to really address how electoral concerns influence elite positions. And here I mean elected officials on the issue. And what I mean here is, what incentives do people who are running for office or already elected into office have to adopt these anti-immigrant positions and propagate these myths and stereotypes about immigrants and immigration? What incentives do they have? Why are they doing that? And I will give you two answers. One, we know that in the rise of polarization, and in particular, the way that political scientists describe polarization is that it has been disproportionately on the right, which we call asymmetric polarization. And what has happened, especially kind of post 2010 Tea Party, is that we have more and more extreme members and sort of radicalization of some components of the Republican Party that are more willing to challenge Republicans, particularly in primary races. And what that means is it creates this pressure by elected officials or candidates to adopt more and more extreme positions, because we know primaries represent ideologically extreme voters relative to the general election. So in order to get through a primary, you may see Republican elected officials or candidates adopt these more extreme positions because they're afraid of getting primary. But we also know that part of why they're adopting these positions is because it is tapping into sentiments that are in there in the public, right? That they are stoking fears, right? We need to be honest about how race, both of immigrants, but also fears and stereotypes are motivating people, but also cultural and demographic threat are driving these feelings and support for certain policies and support for political candidates. In other words, for some elected officials and candidates, adopting these positions, even if they know the myths are false, can help them win. And so they have an incentive to do so. And finally, I would suggest that we need to focus on areas of agreement among the public and among political elites to achieve some progress. We're stuck in a loop where we basically have executives, meaning the president, who is using executive action to do things on immigration, but we're not moving the needle forward at all in Congress. And the current loop that we're on is we had Obama, for example, do some things by executive action, for example, DACA. And then we had Trump come into office and undo some of those things and then put in some other policies. And now we have Biden come into office and issue a flurry of executive actions, undoing a lot of things that Trump has done, which I think is important that he's done that. But I want to be clear that what he's mostly has done so far is to move us back to status quo before Trump was in office, which is not quite the same as moving forward on actual immigration reform. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm happy to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Sophia. What an incredible presentation. Just a quick reminder to everyone that during this Q&A portion, if you have a question, please do submit it through the Q&A box that is at the bottom of the screen. All right, so to begin, returning to, you discussed a little bit about the detainment of child migrants, and we have a question regarding the Biden administration's use of still locking up immigrant children, and wondering, has this always been the solution, or is the Biden administration just picking up where the Trump administration left off?
So child detention predates Trump, So it was done in the Obama administration. It is actually something that we have had for quite some time. The difference is child detention has looked different under different presidents, both in terms of what were the conditions of detention, but also how long children were detained and what was the reason that they were detained. So there are two different groups of children who are typically detained. One is children who came unaccompanied, and unaccompanied means that they didn't come with a parent. And under some administrations, and this is where it gets really kind of confusing to compare across administrations, some administrations interpreted unaccompanied as you're not with a parent, but you could have been with another adult. Most of us probably would say that doesn't count as truly unaccompanied if another adult was with you, especially if it was a relative. Some administrations have interpreted this as if you were completely by yourself. And then under the Trump administration, we also had children detained because they were intentionally, at the time of crossing the border, separated from the family member that they were with. That was family separation, and the zero tolerance policy is what it was called. The Biden administration has, and increasingly in the last few days, there has been a lot of questions, particularly for the press secretary, on the question of child detention, in part because there has been a reopening of a facility that was closed under the Trump administration after sort of an outcry. And what the Biden administration has said is that because of the requirements for spacing and other types of social distancing and safety protocols for COVID, that they needed to reopen a facility because they have to space out. Now, a lot of immigration rights activists have decried this action and said, well, but the alternative is you should be moving very quickly to get children placed with sponsors, release them to family members. And in fact, legally, under the Flores agreement, children are not supposed to be held for very long. It's a 72-hour window that they're supposed to be held, but we know that under all previous administrations, there have been longer periods that children have been held.
Perfect. Thank you, Sophia. We have another question. Let's see. Public perception is that the Democratic Party is the pro-immigration party, but that is clearly not the entire picture. What would you say is the difference in presentation between Republicans and Democrats that causes this perception gap?
So speaking as a person who identifies as a progressive and as someone who would place themselves on an ideological spectrum as pretty far left, in the circles that I run with, people wouldn't say the Democratic Party is super left on immigration because, why did we see 3 million deportations? Why have we seen some framing around crime, et cetera, propagated by Democratic elected officials? But if we're talking about relative to Republicans, only one party right now is talking about immigrants in more humanistic language, talking about pathways to citizenship. Right now, immigration has become so polarized between the parties that even in, for example, if we go back to 2010, the DREAM Act, which, really, if we're talking about a policy that should have been easy to get through, the DREAM Act gives a pathway to citizenship to undocumented youth who were either serving in the military or attending college. We couldn't even get agreement there from Republicans on that particular bill. Now, and there's all kinds of critiques of framing around deservingness of dreamers. But putting those aside, if we can't get agreement on that from Republicans, then it doesn't really seem like we're going to get agreement on a lot of things. Likewise, only one party right now is running those political campaigns and those ads and talking about building a wall, right? Democrats have denounced building a wall, and building a wall is basically a symbolic thing. I mean, one interesting thing just from my book is that we found that, the three reasons that the wall is justified is that in theory, it's going to stop undocumented immigrant flows, it's going to stop terrorism, it's going to stop drugs. What we found was that even though Republicans in our study, it was about 85 to 90% supported, Republicans or conservatives supported building a wall, they expressed a lot of skepticism that the wall would actually work for the stated reasons, meaning they didn't believe it was actually going to stop undocumented immigrant flows. They thought it wouldn't be very effective. But it's interesting to think through, why would people support a policy like building a border wall if you don't think it'll be effective? And what we suggest in that book is that it's because of the symbolic power of the wall to divide and to really distinguish, this is us, this is you, and keep you out, right? That it's a racialized symbol. And really, if we're talking about that meta level, then there's pretty big differences between the parties. But I think your point is absolutely correct that Democrats have been pro immigration enforcement on a number of different dimensions. That I think many people who think of themselves as left Democrats, not moderate or centrist or independents, they would probably say that the Democratic Party has disappointed them on some of their positions on immigration.
Thank you. We have another question. In your eyes, how likely is it that Congress will pass immigration reform, and what might that look like?
Can I clarify? Do you mean right now? Whoever asked that, is it possible to reply when you ask the question? Do you mean reform in this moment or ever?
Let's go with in this moment.
Sure.
And also I'll let you know if they end up.
Okay. I think it really depends. Right now, the Republican Party is struggling pretty seriously with basically two very different ideas about what the party should be. I think establishment Republicans actually probably would work with some Democrats on some components of immigration reform. Now, whether they'll feel they have the political will and the willingness to do so is a different question. If you're asking me if the people who really identify as Trump Republicans in Congress, people who are in the House Freedom Caucus, right, and those groups overlap some, I think that they're not going to support these things necessarily unless it was, the only bill that I could see them supporting that isn't just like an enforcement bill, which the Democrats will obviously not support. I think they would support a pathway to citizenship through military service. Some of my work has shown in particular how a military pathway is particularly strong in motivating conservative and Republican support. But I think that, the more moderate wing of Republicans, I think they could work with people if they wanted to, but they would probably, just in much of the same way that they risk themselves to speak out against the insurrection and impeach Trump, they would face political backlash and potential primary from the right. So there has to be people who are willing to do that. And unfortunately, given the design of the Senate, it needs to be a large number of people in order to move forward, and unless they get rid of the filibuster, which is a whole nother separate thing.
Thank you. Let's see. We have a couple people pointing out that there's been a lot of evidence of people not really caring about the facts. And I think that they're kind of responding to one of your last bullet points about kind of how we move on from here.
Yeah.
So one of the questions was, what are your thoughts on how we can actually get to fact-based conversations considering the current denial of facts?
So this is actually, if there's like one thing that I spend probably way too much of my own time right now thinking in my scholarship about is, but what are we going to do now that that misinformation is out there and there's widespread belief, right? Because it's one thing if we're talking about a very tiny number of people, the level of belief in these stereotypes around immigration or that the election was stolen, these are large segments of the population. And unfortunately, the research on how we correct misinformation is really discouraging. And it's discouraging because what we know is that there's a cognitive process when we try to correct information. And in fact, I tried to do that in the book. We try to give people information about the consequences of these three policies. Would it change their opinions? Would it make them less supportive? In other words, we told them, okay, the wall is going to increase border deaths. The wall is going to cost us much money. The wall is going to have these impacts, right? Almost nothing changed opinions on any issue. On child detention and family separation, we talked about abuse in detention, kids being permanently separated from their parents. Nothing reduced support for these policies except the cost of the border wall. And that tracks on the research that we have on correcting misinformation, that it's really hard to do because we know a cognitive process kicks in when we give people information and facts that are inconsistent with their prior beliefs. It's actually a cognitive process to reject that information, and that is actually the most likely outcome. And so this then comes down to who are messengers that we are willing to hear information from. And we are living in an incredibly polarized media environment where there's quote unquote mainstream media and conservative media. And these are largely silos that are speaking to themselves with different political realities. And there's even now been demonization of expert testimony, that experts are not experts, that there's no information, there's no facts, because we used to use experts to give people facts and people would listen to that. But we know, especially on the right, there's more skepticism about expert information. So at this point, I think what would be required is messengers that people trust from their respective groups, meaning if Republican elites and Democratic elites were repeating the same set of facts to their respective constituencies, I think that there would be more widespread belief. So if we imagine, Mitch McConnell had said the election was stolen or not stolen, and that was false much earlier than he did, that probably would have had a different outcome on public opinion. And so I think that's one way. I recently gave this talk and somebody suggested, well, do you think that faith leaders could play a role? And I think they could also play a role in their respective church communities. That's also possible. I think we're living in a polarized enough environment that we need to think about what is the right messenger that people may be able to sit with information that is a little bit inconsistent with their prior beliefs. And the other thing I'll say is that there's really good research on correcting beliefs that says a method called deep canvassing can work. And so deep canvassing means having these much longer conversations with people who are different from you that can really shift opinions, but it's really hard to replicate that on sort of the level that we need to, given the level of misinformation. But it tells us something about what does it mean when two people who have very different views connect through a much longer conversation with a very specific setup that allows an opening to think about something differently.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's see, we have another question. How can our democratic processes be more inclusive to immigrants?
Oh, I think one way is absolutely, if we think about engagement, politically, socially, political theorists who study immigration and study citizenship and membership, they say, regardless of what we have done in the laws on immigration, you cannot take away that immigrants are part of the United States and that it is a critical component and that they live in communities and they engage in schools and work. And so you should treat people more humanely. You should actually engage them. You should really address with policies ways to support immigrants and address that there is racism that is directed, that there's xenophobia that's directed. You have to have policies, right? We have this impulse to want to have policies that are race neutral, but we know that that doesn't actually address disparities that groups face. So we need to actually address those things, and we need to have honest conversations, and we need elites to be honest about how important immigrants are for our society. In fact, increasingly economists are saying that if we probably do not increase immigration levels, given the demographics of this country and sort of the aging population, in terms of what proportion of the population is aging, that we could really be in trouble as a country. We could be facing similar things to Japan, where we don't have enough younger people who are working, and that immigration will largely be an important part of economic growth of this country. So we really need to think much more holistically, think about incorporation, and really move to a much more a kind of place of empathy and justice.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sophia. And yeah, unfortunately, we've run out of time for our Q&A portion of the night. But Sophia, I'd love to just gather any final thoughts from you or resources that you'd like to direct the audience to. We'll also be sending a follow-up email to all of our participants so that they can have a full list.
So if there was one thing that I would ask people to do is that I would ask you to, or two things, try to leave your own media environment and look at different sources that are talking about immigration. I think it's important for people to do so. And if you know people who have different attitudes than yourself on immigration, try to have conversations with those people. Try to reach out to them, try to think about it. And sorry, I lied, three things. And if you believe strongly in these things, push your elected officials to move forward on these issues and actually move forward policies that are going to move us in a positive direction on immigration.
Wonderful. Well, to everyone from Humanities Washington, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, a huge, huge thank you to Sophia for such an incredible presentation. Thank you so much for partnering with us in this event.
Thank you so much. And thanks for everyone coming out. I really appreciate it.
Definitely. All right. Well, Sophia and everyone else, I hope you have a great night. And thank you again for coming. All right. Goodbye, everyone.